This podcast is a collaboration between Costard and Touchstone Productions and the Tales from the Crypt podcast. Hi, I'm Alan Katz. Welcome to another episode of the How Not to Make a Movie podcast. And yet, not just another episode. I've been making this podcast for going on 4 years now. 160 plus episodes, one a week, pretty much ever since I first started dropping them. And can I tell you, it has been such a joy, a pleasure, a challenge too, a nonstop revelation, and a mission that goes far beyond this podcast. It's because of this podcast that I've plunged completely into podcasting. Costard and Touchstone makes this podcast and 3 others currently available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, with a dozen or so more on the way. I really, really like podcasting. I would even say it's the thing I always wanted to be when I grew up. I just needed to wait for it to be invented so I could do it and be it. And can I tell you, podcasting as a creative form, it makes me happier than any other creative medium I've ever worked in. And the absolute truth is, all of this, it really did start with Tales from the Crypt. Looking back now as Crypt experiences a resurgence, it's only in looking back that I suddenly began to appreciate what actually happened when I was doing Crypt. You know how it is with not seeing forest for all the damn trees in the way. Good thing time provides all the perspective you need. And that's why writers set so many stories in the past, because the stories can be told with perspective. Pretty much everyone who worked on Tales, looking back at their careers, they would tell you that making Crypt was one of the signature experiences of any of our working lives. It was really special. In large part, that was because we were given the creative freedom to do our jobs by HBO and by our executive producers, and in turn, to a person. Everyone brought their A game. Now, when Gil Adler and I went aboard Crypt in its 3rd season, that was supposed to be the end of it, the last season of Tales from the Crypt. You see, Crypt didn't start out like any other TV show. It never went through a normal development process. When Tales from the Crypt was created back in the early 90s, TV was here and feature films were way the fuck over here. And today, of course, people go back and forth between TV and feature films all the time. But back then, that didn't happen. The occasional Tom Hanks or Robin Williams would go from TV to features. But if you were going from features into TV, that meant that your career was going down the toilet. So vast chasm between the two. HBO at that time was still basically movies, and they were just beginning to dip their toe into creative original programming. They had a show called First and 10, Brian Benben's show Dream On. Really, these were just single camera shows with tits and the word fuck. But you take those out of the equation, really, for the most part, those could have been network shows. But then these 4 huge Hollywood mega producers, Joel Silver, Dick Donner, Walter Hill, Bob Zemeckis, they approached HBO and they said, we want to put feature film vision inside your little teeny TV box. HBO jumped up and down and said, yes, do whatever you want. And that's basically what the executive producers did. They just started making their TV show. They started writing scripts. They never went through a development process in any way, shape, or form. Yes, okay, you're going to be adapting a comic book into a TV series. The question is, how are you going to bring all those franchise concepts from the EC Comics, the comic books, into your TV series? How are you going to make every single frame feel like a comic book, feel like one of the EC comic books? That really is the assignment. That's what the audience is going to tune in expecting to see every week. It's just the nature of TV. The audience wants a fix of a very particular thing every single week. Well, they never did that. They just started writing scripts. The other thing that they didn't do was develop the Crypt Keeper. We'll come back to that. And another thing that they didn't do was get a deficit partner. The way that TV series worked back in the day, and basically they still work the same way now. Whenever that first run, or whether it's NBC or HBO, wherever, whatever the outlet is, that first run or even the second run, whatever the license fee they pay to show an episode of a TV show, it's not going to cover the cost of what it costs to make that TV show. In the old days of TV, when I went through, in order to get to profits, a TV show was going to have to make 65 episodes. 65 was the magic number for syndication. That was based on 65. The ad cycle in syndication was 13 weeks. You're going to strip an episode. You're going to strip a show 5 days a week. So 5 times, that's Monday to Friday. 5 times 13 is 65. If you get to 65, there was the possibility that a show could eventually become profitable or hugely profitable for the people who had made it. So I said, back in the day, the magic number was 65, and you would get a deficit partner who would take that gamble and put up the money to pay for the series to get made in hopes that you'd get to 65. Well, of course, HBO, completely different format because they don't need 65. It's all subscription based. Their subscribers are paying for it. So they don't care if it ever gets into profits. It's neither here nor there to them as the network. And because the executive producers didn't really care about it either, well, they didn't think about it. The first season was 6 episodes, and I guess that was paid for. But the second season, 18 episodes, since nobody was minding the store where the franchise was or minding the budget, the night before the wrap party of season 2, the HBO handed the executive producers a financial statement. HBO had been covering all the costs of production beyond what had been agreed to, and they handed the executive producers a financial statement that said, guys, you're $1 million cash in the hole. If you want your season 3, and there was considerable money in the budget for the executive producers, more than $1 million they had to give HBO. HBO said, give us our $1 million back or no season 3. Well, the executive producers promptly canceled the wrap party. They fired everybody, and they got out their checkbooks, and they gave HBO $1 million, which they promptly took off the budget of season 3. HBO wanted Gil, my partner at that time, and my good friend now, and my creative partner now at various projects, they wanted Gil to take over as the producer. The reason that HBO wanted Gil is because, first of all, he's a great producer. Gil came out of the theater, but he trained as an accountant. And so Gil understood the basic idea that if you have $1 to spend on your movie, don't spend $1, you ain't got it. Now, if you can make your movie for 99 cents, 98 cents, make it still look like that dollar, well, that's really good. If you can make, for 97 cents, make it look like $1, $1, $2, $3, well, now you're on to something. The nature of Gil's approach to making theater, a movie, a TV show, all creative endeavors is problem solving. And rather than throw money at problems, Gil's answer was throw more creativity at them. And so Gil and I that's one of the reasons why we worked so well together. We take the same approach to problem solving. Gil had gone aboard a show a troubled HBO show called Vietnam War Stories. They were way over schedule. Budget was just out of whack. And Gil went aboard and saved it. It was a high-profile show. And not only did he save it and bring it in on time and on budget, it won some awards. And when suddenly the Tales from the Crypt executive producers were having a similar kind of problem, out of control budget, out of control executive producers, HBO thought Gil would be the perfect cure. And since I was Gil's writing partner, I went along for the ride. Lucky me. My 2 jobs when Gil and I took over Tales from the Crypt, I was the franchise meister. And part of my job was to take the franchise from the comic books and make sure that every single frame of the TV show felt like the comic books. That was one of my jobs. So every script had to pass through me. Mine were the last set of fingertips that touched the keyboard before the scripts went out to our department heads or eventually to the cast. My other job was to write Crypt Keeper segments. Now, like I said, Tales from the Crypt never went through a development process. And just like this, the concept underneath the show was never developed. No one ever asked the question, who is the Crypt Keeper? Crypt Keeper in the comic books, in the EC comics, is an old white guy with stringy hair. But the executive producers wanted their own Crypt Keeper, and they decided that it would be a puppet, and Joel Silver found Kevin Yeager. And Kevin found John Kassir, who became the Crypt Keeper's voice. So they had a great puppet, they had a great voice, but at no point did anyone ever ask in those first 2 seasons, but who is he? So as a result, whoever wrote the script would throw some words at the Crypt Keeper, and that's pretty much what the Crypt Keeper would say. And through 24 episodes, basically he was just the puppet called the Crypt Keeper who talked. My problem in trying to write for that character is I don't know how to write for a non-character. How do you write for a cipher, especially if you want it to be funny? So just to do my damn job, I had to create a character for him. Now, as I've talked about in this podcast many, many times, I grew up a huge fan of old movies. Marx Brothers. Groucho is a god to me. And I saw the Crypt Keeper as my little Groucho. Having to fill him with a personality and being a writer and therefore sort of kind of lazy, I reached for the closest thing at hand, which was me. And so I filled the Crypt Keeper with me. And so he looks like Kevin's puppet, sounds like John's voice, but every word that came out of his head, every thought in his head was me. Something happened during the 3rd season. We, instead of escorting Tales from the Crypt to its crypt, the fortunes turned around. Suddenly, HBO ordered more seasons. Universal Pictures ordered a couple of feature films, and the Crypt Keeper went from being just the puppet called the Crypt Keeper to becoming the franchise. Universal Pictures got very excited, and they wanted three movies. Executive producers, the Crypt partners, got very excited. They said, yeah, let's do it. And we hemmed and hawed about the first one, as we've talked about on this podcast, but we ultimately settled on Demon Knight. Now, the mandate was to do the 3 different movies, and Gil and I wanted to do something very different for the second Tales from the Crypt feature film. And we've told the story of the making of Dead Easy on this podcast. As I've said, making Tales from the Crypt was a great creative experience because of the freedom we had, but I think we were making something that we all cared about. We all cared about deeply, and that was true about Demon Knight. We all really wanted to make that movie. It was, and it reflects the passion of the filmmakers. The mandate from Universal was to make 3 different motion pictures, 3 different Tales from the Crypt movies. And what Gil and I wanted to do for the second Crypt feature was something completely different. As I've also said here, Gil and I, neither of us came out of horror, but horror was where the money was. And okay, we were looking to find some way to demonstrate to the town that we weren't one-trick ponies. And we'd found this script. The original script was called Fat Tuesday, and we developed it into a thing called Dead Easy. It was a very different from Demon Knight. Dead Easy was a taut psychological thriller that took place in the swamps outside New Orleans. It was about a recovered memory, had a great villain, this incredible Harlequin character. And Gil and I really, well, the whole creative team, we saw Dead Easy as a way to break out. Universal Pictures was down with it because they sent us to New Orleans for months. We were prepping it. We were casting it. We had a young unknown actress that we were interested in named Salma Hayek, who we thought would be a great female lead. We were in New Orleans getting ready, and 3 weeks before the start of principal photography, 3 weeks, Universal Pictures said, stop, don't spend another penny. Come home. You are not making Dead Easy. We returned to Los Angeles, befuddled, and they stuck this other script in front of our noses. It was called Bordello of Blood. They said, "You're going to make this instead. Your release schedule hasn't changed. You still start in 3 weeks. Get going, guys. Get going." Now, where the hell did Bordello of Blood come from? Well, and about this time, a newfangled studio called DreamWorks had suddenly emerged from Universal. Steven Spielberg left his deal at Universal, but not the lot. And as DreamWorks began making deals with talent, Universal was desperately afraid of losing another big piece of talent. My executive producer, Bob Zemeckis, because Steven was Bob's mentor. Universal, desperately afraid of losing Bob, said, "Bob, what can we do to keep you at Universal? We love you." And as we've discussed on this podcast, the thing that was one of the deal points, it wasn't it, but one of the deal points was Bordello of Blood, was the purchase of Bordello of Blood for $500,000. I ended up telling the stories of the making of Bordello of Blood and how that awful decision by Universal, it's not an unimaginable decision. I mean, you kind of get why they made it, but it wasn't catastrophic to anybody but me, and I think to the Tales from the Crypt franchise, because it was really terrible for the Tales from the Crypt franchise, and it really impacted me terribly. And the movie is a mediocre little piece of shit. Ultimately, I crashed and burned because of the result of it. I went on, I did a couple seasons on The Outer Limits, and those were two really good creative years. My son Tristan was born up in Vancouver while I was making The Outer Limits. But I was really beginning to head down this, I was already into it, this 2-decade-long deepening depression. It ultimately became a writer's block. And I found myself suddenly, I could write for other people, but I couldn't write for me. I became more and more detached from, I don't know, from my creative self. I gave myself over to raising my 2 kids, my son and my daughter, and I poured myself into being a dad, and that was wonderful. I wouldn't change that for the world. But a big piece of me was missing, and I think that haunted me. As I've also said on this podcast, in the story of the making of Bordello of Blood, I came within inches of hurting myself badly, fatally, perhaps. And it was in the rebound of that and dealing with the secret that I've been keeping from myself for 2 decades about the fact that I was sexually molested twice by the religious director of the synagogue where my family belonged when I was a kid. It wasn't until I confronted that I was finally able to really to connect with myself. If you can't tell your own story to you, can you really tell anybody else's story? I think that's what I bumped into. I think that's what was haunting me. And though confronting the secret that I've been keeping for myself for all that time was incredibly difficult, it's true what they say about the truth setting you free. And when I was suddenly able to tell my own story to me and tell my story to other people, because keeping secrets not a good thing. And so it was important not just to tell it to me, but to be able to tell it and contextualize it for everyone else. Once I could tell my story to other people, I could tell other people's stories too. And I think that's when like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, I think I went from being a good writer into being a storyteller. Now, I had been telling these Bordello of Blood stories for 20 years. It was a kind of therapy, trying to explain what had happened to me creatively and why I got so lost. Then the pandemic hit and the lockdown, and podcasting went from being fringe to being a player. As the pandemic was winding down, a Tales from the Crypt fan group called Dads from the Crypt They review episodes of Tales from the Crypt and give parenting advice, which I thought was hilarious. Jason, one of the dads from the Crypt, reached out to me and said, we're going to be reviewing one of the episodes you wrote. You want to sit in with us? And I said, yeah, sure. And I sat in and gave my parenting advice, and it's great fun. A couple of weeks later, Jason reached out to me again. He said, hey, we're going to be reviewing Bordello of Blood. You want to sit in again? And I said, Jason, the story of the making of Bordello of Blood is not just a half-hour conversation with you. It's a whole podcast unto itself. And suddenly I realized what it was that I had to do. And all the stories I'd been telling as a kind of catharsis for 20 years, I could put into one unified catharsis. Of course, in order to do this, because part of what was going to be important was to tell the story as honestly as possible, as those of you who've listened to the story, I think, can attest. In order to do that, I had to reach out to Gil, which I did, and he reluctantly agreed, and I'm very glad he did, because not only did it produce what Entertainment Weekly called the best film podcast of 2022, but it rekindled our relationship, our friendship. Part of the deal with Gil and I doing the podcast, that first season especially, was, we hadn't talked in 25 years. And there were still some rather raw emotions and a lot of it rather prickly. I did not want to have any of the conversations beforehand. I wanted to have them all on mic, and whenever happened. And Gil agreed that that's what would happen. And so, yeah, everything that played out between us emotionally in terms of getting back together again, it all happened live on mic. It was absolutely real. I really, that part of the storytelling process, the realness of it, the rawness of it, that appealed to me so much in making that first season of Tales from the Crypt, and making the first season of the How Not to Make a Movie podcast. And the second season, we had to expand the franchise a little bit, and it was about the craft of making movies and TV shows, and inside baseball, nuts and bolts, and what happens when craft turns to crap. And so that's what it became up until this point. But because I made the How Not to Make a Movie podcast, and I was working with Gil, and I was involved with the TV business again, but I had a certain amount of perspective in terms of what was involved in making a podcast versus making a TV show or a feature film. Well, my friend Hal approached me. I think I was in my third season doing the third season, it's like the third season of How Not to Make a Movie podcast. And Hal wanted to turn the story of his life, the one that became The Donor, a DNA horror story, he wanted to turn it into a TV series or a movie. And of course, it's really difficult material. It's so tricky, and he needed to tell the story anonymously. If he had made it as a movie or TV show, they would have forced him to compromise his story, everything in 1,000 different ways, just because of the cowardice. These are risk-averse people, and they don't want to offend anybody. It was just not the right environment to tell the story the best way possible, which is honestly. I convinced Hal to turn The Donor, a DNA horror story, into a podcast. And it was while producing that podcast that I suddenly realized I had become the thing I always wanted to be. Film and TV are great, but podcasting, to take an idea from my head and turn it into a movie or a TV show, even under the best of circumstances. To write a script takes, for a movie or TV show, years. Gosh, a movie is just one story. Yes, that can still take you 3, 4, 5 years to get it right. TV series, just to get that first pilot script done. That's also 3, 4, 5 years. But with the TV series, you got to create, well, all right, you wrote the pilot. What happens immediately after that? Episode 2 through, how long is that first season, and how many seasons you want to do, and what's the arc of the first season? What's the story arc of the whole thing? you got to work all that out. You got to know who all the characters are, and you got to write all that down. And that takes time and energy too. More years in the making. And then in order to get it, then you want people in the executive suites to read your material. Well, it's really hard to get people to read. The other thing you have to create is what's called a pitch deck, a comic book like version of not just the show, but why they should read the show. And that's just to get them to read so that they'll say yes, so you can get into the top, the very tippy top of the meat grinder. Never mind what's going to happen as it goes through the meat grinder and all the different parts of it, the stuff that will come out as sausage at the end of this process. Never mind. Years, energy, emotional agita. Then there are thousands of assholes standing in your way. And at any point in the process, any one of those assholes can kill your project dead just because they're an asshole. Now, with a podcast, that script can get written a lot more quickly because there's no visuals. It's just sound. And there's only one asshole ever standing in my way, and that's me. And so long as I'm willing to get the work done and create the content, all right, I got to go find the audience or help the audience find the content, but I'm willing to take that challenge. And so it really becomes about creating great content, telling great stories. It's important to tell a great story the right way. It's very easy to take a great story and reduce it to crap. That's really simple. It's easier to do than you can imagine. But with podcasting, I found that as a storytelling medium, you can't beat it for its emotional honesty. One of the very appealing things about telling stories via podcasting is the way that people experience it. They listen to our stories via earbuds or earphones or in their cars, which that's really just a giant sound pod. And they take our voices and their stories and they put them right between their ears in the most sensitive place they have inside their heads. And that's an honor. It's a privilege. There are responsibilities. Now, in telling the story of the donor and in doing the research, I opened a door onto a world I had no idea existed, the donor conceived world. Telling Hal's story was indeed very complicated. It's a hard story to tell because it's so morally gray. That was the appeal to me, was to tell that story and not tell the audience what to think, but to present the world with all of its possibilities and to let you all make up your minds. How do you feel about this? Now, of course, I had certain thoughts about it, and they're there, but I don't beat you over the head with them. But the storytelling in the medium, I found it incredibly exciting. And while doing the background research on the donor conceived world, well, that's how I met Donna Hall. And Donna was one of the donor conceived people who very kindly agreed to give me information on what it was like to be donor conceived. And when Donna told me her story, well, Donna was a podcast unto herself, which she had been trying to do. It's like I said, the problem is a great story like Donna's, you still got to tell it the right way. And Donna agreed to let me tell her story. And that suddenly became the hall closet. Telling Donna's story opened even more doors. Her family is unlike any family I'd ever encountered in my entire life. And telling Donna's story opened the door to her brother, Herb Hack. And one of the projects that's coming up, actually, we're going to start working on it in the next couple of weeks, but sometime this summer, early fall, there will be a podcast about the Herb Hack story. I don't know what it's called yet, unfortunately, but they'll tell you more information as we get closer to it. But this is the story of a guy who, Herb's about 60 now. He has spent half his life behind bars. And why that happened to him, you can't grow up as Donna Hall did in a lower tier crime family outside of Philadelphia in the 80s and 90s without being impacted. That's Herb's story. But like I said, telling Donna's story, gosh, there's another door that opened, and that's Tom Lowenstein, who wrote the book of The Trials of Walter Ogrod, which is about Donna's family. In fact, when Donna, one of her story is so strange. One of Donna's dibblings, one of her donor-conceived siblings, hipped Donna to the fact that this book called The Trials of Walter Ogrod existed, and it told the story of Donna's family. And when Donna got a hold of Tom Lowenstein's book and read it, she learned things about her own family that she didn't even know. A remarkable story. Well, Tom Lowenstein, who, because of his book, really that's the main reason that Walter Ogrod is no longer on death row in Pennsylvania, and why the state of Pennsylvania paid him $9 million, paid Walter Ogrod $9 million because of what they did in accepting this bullshit confession from John Hall. Well, Tom Lowenstein and I are working on a project. Tom wants to tell the entire John Hall saga as the first season of a brand new podcast called I Need to Tell You. And Tom telling the entire John Hall saga will blow your mind. Touch on some of the stuff that we've already touched on, a little bit of Donna's story, a little bit of Herb's story, but there's so much more to John Hall's story. What a remarkable master criminal. So that project is coming. Other incredible collaborations that have happened, because that's just how the podcasting world is. I'm working on a really cool podcast, a fiction podcast called Magic Life with magician Wes Isley and the Blues Clues co-creator Dave Palmer. I'm working on another podcast about, it's called What Makes Us Laugh with comedian G.D. Fenderson. There are so many more podcasts coming. There are the three that are coming right down the pipe, right off the bat. I'm especially excited about. There's one called Just the Photographer, which I'm doing with a photojournalist named David Swanson. David has been a photojournalist for 40 years. He took one of the iconic photos of 9/11 of the first responders down in the pit. He's been to every war zone since then, from Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq, covered the LA wildfires, covered the Oscars. Though in theory, pictures speak thousands of words, what David has found despite a whole career of taking pictures, is that the pictures can tell you what it looked like to be standing right there taking this picture, but it cannot tell you what it felt like to be in that place. And that's what Just the Photographer, David's podcast, is all about, what it was like to take those pictures and experience those moments. I'm working with another journalist named Manila Chan on a really cool podcast called A Secret War. Manila is Lao American. She has always wanted to tell the story of the Secret War. The most bombed country in the history of the world is Cambodia. And the United States of America bombed it every day for 8 years during the Vietnam War, because that's the North Vietnamese were running it was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's not a trail, it was a supply chain, a supply network. They ran it through Laos to supply their soldiers fighting in South Vietnam. They weren't supposed to do that. We bombed every day to try to stop the North Vietnamese from doing that. We weren't supposed to do that either. What the North Vietnamese were doing wasn't nearly as destructive as what we did. We plunged some of that nation back into the Stone Age. In fact, a third of it is still uninhabitable because of all the unexploded American ordnance. It is a tragedy what we did to the country of Laos. And Manila has wanted to tell this story. Well, she wanted to tell the whole story throughout. She was a journalist for 25 years, a just the facts kind of journalist. And every time she tried to tell this story, the powers that be shot her down, just not interested. So this A Secret War is Manila's story, both of the Secret War, but also her war to tell this story of the Secret War. That also is coming this summer, as is Tom Lowenstein's I Need to Tell You This, telling the John Hall story, and David Swanson's Just the Photographer. Those are all coming this summer. There's another project that also is going to be coming later this summer, and that's a really, really personal project. The Live Bullshit Free podcast. We live in bullshit's golden age. Not a good thing. Bullshit is kicking truth's ass, and that won't be good for anyone in the long run and at the end of the day. And I'm going to talk about in the Live Bullshit Free podcast how America got into this mess, less a political take than it is a cultural take. But more importantly, I'm going to talk about how I think we might be able to get out of this, because I think there are ways. Hey, at the end of the day, I am an eternal optimist. Now, what all these different things that I just talked about, what they mean for this podcast is that the How Not to Make a Movie podcast is about to go on a brief hiatus until the fall, when it will relaunch with brand new graphics that I've been working on and a slightly readjusted focus, kind of back towards how it started. That I really liked the deep dive into how Bordello got made and interviewing people and really down to the marrow of how not to make a movie. So I want to focus a lot more on movies whose making induced a kind of madness among its movie makers. We'll do an even deeper dive into Caligula, which we've already done, and that's our most popular episode. Hey, I can take a hint. But we'll also look at movies like Heaven's Gate, Apocalypse Now, Waterworld, Fitzcarraldo, The Island of Dr. Moreau, our good friend John Frankenheimer. All of those movies challenged their filmmakers, all of whom put themselves into situations they shouldn't have put themselves into. Movie makers, this experience, you should have known better. That's why I'm not going to include movies like Plan 9 from Outer Space, because, that's just not a fair fight. Yes, of course, that was a disaster. He was a well-meaning naive. And the How Not to Make a Movie podcast, I'd rather focus on people who should know better. Well, that will be the fall. And in the meantime, we'll do a couple of special episodes. And please, if you want to keep in touch, check out our Patreon page. There will be special bonus episodes along the way that, in fact, a couple that we're working on already. So this isn't even remotely goodbye. It ain't even so long or farewell. It's more like abiento. See you soon. Keep in touch. I mean, I will if you will. The How Not to Make a Movie podcast is executive produced by me, Alan Katz, by Gil Adler, and by Jason Stein. Our artwork was done by the amazing Jody Webster, and Jason Jody, along with Mando, are all the hosts of the fun and informative Dads from the Crypt podcast. Follow them for what my old pal the Crypt Keeper would have called terrific Crypt content.